In this video, we're going to talk about utility and preferences and how they are connected to consumer choice and ultimately economic demand. So, utility is the word that economists use to describe usefulness. And so, utility is the usefulness of a good or a service or a resource. It's a pretty straightforward concept. Now, utility is personal. It is specific to an individual. We can see an example here of two choices that you might have for lunch. The usefulness of the pizza or the kale salad there depends upon the person. It depends upon their preferences, and so we say that utility is personal. It's specific to an individual, and we can see another example of that on Friday night. You may be able to go to the opera or to go to the baseball game, and how useful each of these forms of entertainment is depends upon the person. Some people prefer the opera to the baseball game, and others would prefer spending the day watching baseball to going to the opera. So again, utility is personal. It's specific to the individual. Now, utility is a psychological phenomenon. When we're talking about utility, we're talking about an individual person, and when they're weighing the usefulness of something or the utility of something, that's a psychological process where they try to understand how helpful a particular resource or a good or a service will be as a means to helping them achieve their ends. And so this is again related to the fact that when we talk about utility, we're talking about specifically the utility to a particular person, the usefulness of a good or service or a product or a resource to a particular person. So why do we care about utility? Well, it turns out that utility is the basis for economic demand. When we demand things from an economic standpoint, we do so precisely because we feel that they'll be useful. And so an important thing about utility is a utility is really a ranking of the preferences for an individual. And because utility is a ranking, the utility of two people cannot really be directly compared. If two people go to the opera and they both enjoyed it, they both found it useful, we really can't compare the usefulness of the one person and the usefulness of the other person. There's no way to do that. We can only use it when we're talking about a specific person and their preferences. So when we look at utility, we can go back to the different ways we talk about numbers. So we have cardinal numbers, and that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Cardinal utility refers to a utility that's defined in terms of numbers like 1, 2, 3, and 4. So an example of a cardinal number, the Baltimore Ravens football team played against the Kansas City Chiefs, and they won 35-34. And so that's 35 and 34. The score there is a cardinal number, and so that's one way we can think about utility. But the other way we can think about utility is ordinal in nature. It involves ordinal numbers, not 1, 2, 3, 4, but first, second, third, and fourth. So we're ranking the possible choices based on them being first or second or third, as opposed to giving them a number associated with it and then comparing those numbers. Now, this is an example of where we use models in economics. So we know from looking at how people actually make decisions in the real world that ordinal utility is the right concept for utility. People rank choices first, second, third, and fourth, and they choose whatever they rank the highest. So that's what ordinal utility is the correct one, but we use cardinal utility when we as a model for utility, and we assume that we use the as a model for utility as if it were true. We do this for two reasons. One is it's easier for us to understand, but two, and probably more importantly, it produces the same outcome as using ordinal utility when we use it in a model. So we don't lose anything by doing it, and certainly it's certainly easier for us to do it using cardinal numbers, and we don't really give up much in the process of doing that. So here's an example of utility. And we can think of total and marginal utility changing as follows. So in the example here, when the quantity is 1 of a resource or good or service, the marginal utility is 85, and because there's only 1 unit, the total utility is also 85. When we add our second unit of consumption, our second good or resource, a second unit of the good or resource or service, well, that one adds an incremental utility of 79, a margin utility of 79. So it's a positive number. You notice that it's less than the margin utility from the first one, which was 85. So the total utility is the two of those added together, 85 and 79. It's 164. And as we go down the list, you'll notice the margin utility is slowly decreasing, and eventually it goes to 0. And what happens with the total utility is it's increasing, but it's increasing at a slower rate. On the right, we can see this in the graphs. The marginal utility is declining as we consume more units. And the total utility is increasing, but it's increasing at a slower and slower rate, and eventually it flattens off and, as the margin utility becomes 0. So margin utility diminishes with volume. It decreases with volume. Here's another example, a table and graph, where in this case it's chocolate bars. So when we have no chocolate bars eaten, both the marginal and total utility are 0. When we eat our first chocolate bar, the marginal utility of that bar is 70. And since there's only one of them, the total utility is also 70. Very quickly, the marginal utility, as we go to the second one, drops down to 10. And the total utility is the 70 and the 10, which is 80. When we go to 3 and 4 candy bars, that's quite a lot of chocolate. We get to 5 and 3 is the margin utility, and you can see very quickly the total utility also slows down and levels off. So in the bottom graph, you can see the total utility increasing very slightly as it goes along, and the marginal utility starting off on the bottom is the amount of chocolate that's been eaten, the number of units, and you can see the margin utility falling rapidly and then just declining. The total utility would actually be shaped slightly like the total utility would be shaped in the opposite of this margin utility curve. It would rise sharply and then level off, and level off as we had more units. So that's another example. And the point here is that the marginal utility diminishes with volume. So this is a feature of marginal analysis, of marginal utility. It's also true with marginal benefit. They're kind of the same thing. Marginal utility diminishes with volume. The more we have of something, the more we consume of something, well, the less that each incremental unit that we have or consume adds to our utility, to our benefit, to our happiness. So the marginal utility decreases with volume. Now, we say that we make choices when we're choosing that maximize our utility. Our goal in choice is to maximize utility. We sometimes say that people, when they're choosing, are utility maximizers. So that's the goal of our choices, to maximize utility. And there's a reason why we do that. That's if we maximize our utility, then we're going to be maximizing our benefit, the usefulness of goods or services or resources in terms of being a means to the ends that we're trying to achieve. And so we maximize utility. Now, utility, when we make choices, all choices, we're choosing at the margin. So we consider the incremental cost and the incremental benefits. That's the marginal cost and the marginal benefits of each incremental unit, each marginal unit. We choose, as long as the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, we choose to consume more or use more. And the reason is fairly simple. When the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, we haven't consumed enough. We can get more benefit at a low cost. And then we stop consuming or using a good or resource when the marginal cost and the marginal benefits are equal. That's the optimum choice that we're making. If we were to keep consuming and the marginal costs were greater than the marginal benefits, well, then we've consumed too much. And so where the marginal costs and the marginal benefits are equal, where the incremental costs and the incremental benefits are equal, that's the optimum choice. That's the optimum point, and we should stop consuming. So we can look at an example of this, our choices at the margin. If we can eat a slice of pizza or many slices of pizza, we can kind of see this in action. So a pizza has 8 slices, and if we look at maybe the prices of each slice is $2. I put it into dollar figures to make it a little easier to understand. So the marginal cost of each piece is $2. It doesn't actually change. The marginal benefit, the pleasure I get from the first, is associated with $4. The second is 3. The third is 2. And so we can see the decreasing marginal benefit. When I'm making a choice of my first slice, the benefit's greater than the cost, so I should definitely eat that one. With the second slice, the benefit is less than the first, but it's still greater than the cost, so I should eat that one. And then on the third slice, the marginal benefit again is less than the second and certainly less than the first, but it's equal to the marginal cost, and I should eat that one. And then I should stop because the marginal cost and the marginal benefit were equal. If I were to have the fourth slice, the marginal cost would be greater than the marginal benefit, and I would have consumed too much. So 3 slices of pizza is the right choice for me to make. That's the one that maximizes my utility. That's the one that where the marginal cost and the marginal benefits are equal. We have another example of this. Here we're at the Starbucks. We're trying to decide what size cafe latte to get, and so they come in 3 sizes: 12, 16, and 20 ounce. The incremental cost, they're either $2, $3, or $4 depending upon the size. I just kind of throw those numbers in there, and then the marginal benefit decreases. So the marginal cost increases as we consume more. The marginal benefit decreases, and so when I'm at 12 ounces, the marginal benefits are greater than the marginal costs. So that's not quite big enough. When I get to 16 ounces, the marginal cost and the marginal benefits are equal. So that's really the optimal one. That's the one I'm going to choose, the 16-ounce one. And certainly if we looked at the 20-ounce one, the marginal costs are greater than the marginal benefits. So that's consuming too much. So the 16-ounce size, the middle size, is the one that I want to get. That's where my utility is maximized, and that's where where the marginal costs and the marginal benefits are equal. And so we have this principle when we're making choices, when we're choosing things, we know that the marginal rate of substitution is going to be balanced. And what that means is the marginal utility that we get per dollar is going to be equal. What happens if it was unequal? Well, then we would choose more of one thing and less of another thing, and we keep reallocating our choice until the marginal utility per dollar is equal. So there's a balance with the marginal rate of substitution. Now, that's only half of the story. The other half of the story here, and we're talking about consumer choice, is the budget. So the budget is the resources that an individual has available to spend on goods and services. Pretty straightforward idea. Now, the budget line is a consumption possibilities curve. It's very similar to the production possibilities frontier. Same kind of thing. It shows the choice and the trade-offs. So with a given budget, I can have either 10 burgers and no tacos. I can have 30 tacos and no burgers, or some combinations in between. And the everything inside of the budget line is possible. and everything outside of the budget line is beyond our budget, is not possible. And so if we were to look at our budget, the budget depends upon two factors. One is the income that we make, and two is the prices that we face. So the greater is the income, or the lower is the prices, then our budget line is going to be greater. And then conversely, the lesser is the income, the higher the prices, our budget line is less. So it's a direct relationship between the amount of income we have, and of course is affected by the prices that we face. So let's look at these curves here. These are called indifference curves. So indifference curves are curves, and on the x, so we have good y on the y-axis and good x on the x-axis. And so these are combinations of good y and good x that a person would be indifferent to. How would they be indifferent to them? Well, every combination on the line provides the person with the same utility. And if they're getting the same utility, they would be indifferent between one combination of the two goods and another combination of the two goods, as long as they provide the same utility. And so that's what happens on each one of these lines. Now we know that people prefer more to less. So if possible, I want to be on the red line that's the farthest out, because that involves the most of each good x and good y. The blue line below it involves, at every similar point, a little bit less of good y and a little bit less of good x, and the green line involves even less of those products. Now, on the green line, on the blue line, on the red line, once you're on the green line, every point on the green line you're indifferent to, because it provides the same utility. But if I have a choice to be on the blue line or the green line, then I want the blue line. Why? Because the blue line involves more goods and services than the green line. And people prefer more to less. If they have the opportunity to have more at the same cost, they're going to pick that rather than less. And so these are indifference curves. The combinations of goods and services that create the same utility, and the line represents each one of these levels of utility. And the farther out we go, the more goods and services we get, and the more utility we get. Now, the consumer achieves its greatest utility when we put the budget and the utility together. And this is, in this example here, it's the highest indifference curve that they can achieve within their budget. So at point A, this is the highest indifference curve that you can have that shows the utility between the two goods, and it's all same all on the green line. And the point where it's tangent, point A, tangent to the budget line, so the budget line is in black, slanting down. And so the highest indifference curve that's tangent to our budget line is the optimal choice. And the point of tangency, point A, shows us how much of good X and how much of good Y is the optimal amount. So this is how we make our choices and achieve the greatest utility. So the point of tangency indicates the combination of goods that the particular consumer prefers. That's point A here. And he would prefer the red line if he could, but it's outside of its budget, so it's not really possible. It's beyond his means. And certainly the bluish line here would also be possible, but it's within his budget. It's a possible thing, but it represents a less of good Y and X than the green line does. It represents less utility, total utility, than the green line does. So we want to have the farthest out indifference curve that we can that's tangent with our budget. And so that's where the consumer choice winds up. That's a combination of goods and services that the consumer prefers. And we should note that for different people, the indifference curves are going to be different. The indifference curves are specific to a person. It represents their values, their preferences, and such. So for each person, the indifference curves are going to be different. They're going to be sloped different. They're going to have a different shape, and so on. So the indifference curves are specific to the person, and they reflect their preferences. Now, how do we get to individual demand? Well, the budget line and the indifference curves determine the individual demand. The people, marginal utility determines how much people are willing to pay, and consumers will act. They'll keep choosing until the price, which is analogous to the marginal cost, equals the marginal utility or the marginal benefit. And when the marginal utility is greater than the price, they consume more. When the marginal utility is less than the price, well, they're consuming too much and they buy less. And so the optimal point where consumer choice is optimal is where the marginal utility is equal to the price. But that's for an individual. Now, if we look at the market demand curve is the sum of all the individual demand curves. So we add up the quantities that people would buy at each price point, given the differences in their budget lines, given the differences in their preferences, and that when we add all those together and we sum them up, that becomes the market demand. So we have these two vehicles here. Which one has the greater utility? How do we understand how we can maximize utility? Well, the answer, like a lot of these, is it depends. It depends on who it is who's making the evaluations, what their means and ends are, and what their preferences are. So if we look at the choices, we can't just look at the utility. We also have to look at the prices. We have to look at the budget. So we have the three different vehicles here. We have the basic sedan is $27,000. The minivan here is a little bit more expensive. It's $32,000, and then this fancy sports car is $152,000. So when we're doing this, we have to not just look at the utility, but also the budget, and that's what we're doing here. And when we do that for a specific person based on their preferences, so this if the family is the one who's buying it and has a budget that fits within their budget or maximizes their utility based on their budget, then they're going to choose the minivan, and that's the individual demand. And when we add up all the optimal choices for each of the individuals, we get to market demand. So maybe there'll be 5 people in a similar situation where the minivan is the one that maximizes utility on an individual basis. Maybe there's 12 people here who buy the sedan because that maximizes their utility on an individual basis. Maybe they don't have a family. Maybe they don't plan to haul very much. They're commuting. Maybe there's only 2 people or something like that. So in this case, the sedan is more suitable for a certain number of people. The minivan is suitable for some other people, and then the sports car might be suitable for 1 or 2 people. And that's how the market demand is determined. It's the sum of each of the individual demands, and when we sum it all up, we get 1 sports car, 5 minivans, 12 sedans. Now, this shows us the connection between utility, the usefulness of the good, which is based on the individual and their evaluations and their preferences, how it becomes the basis for economic demand. People will maximize their utility. They'll make choices based on their budget that maximize their utility. And when they do that, we can get some notion of what their individual demand is, and then we add up all the individual demands, we get the market demand. And so that's how utility is connected to consumer choice and ultimately to economic demand.